Yeah, this is the fourth Sunday. Culvers and decisions and all kinds of things going on. It's also Sunday that we remind ourselves who we are and what we're doing here and why we're doing it. You know, because we're here to make disciples, who make disciples. That's what we have given ourselves to. So, if you will, say this with me. A disciple is someone who is following Jesus, being changed by Jesus, and on mission with Jesus. And we've been leaning to that second part, being changed by Jesus. Being changed by Jesus. You know, last week we heard Jesus, and he says, "You have heard that it was said, but I say unto you. But I say unto you." And with that statement, he was claiming authority and a wisdom greater than any philosophy, any philosopher, every civilization on how to live in order to experience the good life. And we found out the good life does not come through Plato's just man or Aristotle's virtuous person or the religious leader's law-abiding person. No, we saw that the good life comes through a life that has of a changed heart person. And we realize the problem of all of us, the heart of the problem, is the problem of the heart. See, an only changed heart leads to a changed life, and that's exactly what Jesus came. He came to change our hearts. And after laying down his focus on having a changed heart, through the Sermon on the Mount, he leans into different bad attitudes, wrong attitudes, different ways of we act and live, and he challenged them and emotions and us as people. And today we're going to see he's going to lean into the toughest human emotion of all, which is the emotion of anger. That's why we're talking today about, you know, be Jesus in an age of rage. Now I'll show you a picture, I hope. There we go. Oh, okay. I went too far. I was jumping over the place. There we go. Look familiar? Maybe too familiar? Feel familiar? One thing about anger is universal. It is absolutely universal. And anger, you have either experienced it. Maybe this morning you are experiencing it, your anger in the space, or you will experience it. You know, sometimes we plan, you know, we sort of maybe plan to be angry, but more often than not, something happens to us unexpectedly, and our anger comes upon us without warning, and it just comes, and it's there. I experienced anger this past week here in front of the church. Maggie, our office administrator, she had pulled her car up into the driveway out here on Broadmoor, and she told me she was having engine problems. Her fan her cooling fan would not cut off. It just kept running. She was concerned it was going to kill her battery, which it would. So I was happy to go out and help. Went out and got her keys, popped the hood to the car, and I'm getting ready to look underneath the car. And as I'm there getting ready to work on the car, there's this young couple that comes walking up the sidewalk. I see them coming right, the sidewalk right close to where I'm standing, getting ready to work on the car. So me being the outgoing person that I am, I say, "Hey, how are you doing? Good morning." No response. They just kept walking and talking. I would have expected some kind of response. "Hey, good morning, how are you?" Or, "Hey, we're all right, how are you doing?" Or at least, "Good morning," or "What's up?" Anything, something, some kind of response, acknowledgement that I even existed in that moment with them out there as they walked by. I got nothing. Not a hand wave, not a glance. I was a non-entity to them. Man, I went out of the way to smile at them, to say hi to them, to reach out to them, to acknowledge them. Kept right on walking. Didn't care. So before I decided to do something very un-Jesus-like, I dove back under the hood of the car and began to figure out how to get the fan to quit working. But I was angry. I felt marginalized. I felt, above anything else, I felt disrespected. I think that was the primary thing. I was feeling disrespected and it made me angry. Now, some of you thinking, come on, Scott, get a life. Come on. That's not a big deal. And you're right. Scott, hey, there are other things in the world you can really need to be angry about. And you're right, there are. I know sometimes I'm pretty intense, but I just can't help it. Or maybe I can. Webster says, anger is a feeling of displeasure resulting from injury, mistreatment, opposition, etc., and usually showing itself in a desire to fight back at the supposed cause of this feeling. It's the simplest form. Anger is a spontaneous response. And its function is to alert us to something that has obstructed our wills and our desires. And it immediately causes us to raise an alarm inside of us before we have time to think about it. Now, if our anger passes after the situation passes, it's not a sin. Anger is not a sin if it comes and it goes. Where anger becomes a sin and it becomes a problem for humanity is once the anger happens, if we hold on to it and if we dwell on it and we think about it. Because guess what? The longer we dwell on the anger, the more angry we become. And the more angry we become, the more we want to hurt the person to make them pay for what they did for making us angry. This is the kind of anger that Jesus will be talking about in a passage today. Self-indulging, seeking to hurt others kind of anger that comes from an angry heart. So Jesus speaks to this as he speaks to us and his disciples. And again, he says, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not murder. And anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is what? Angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Notice both murder and anger face the same kind of judgment in the court of judgment. Judgment court. See, the judgment court was the village council that would sit and there'd be different sizes. In a small city of less than 150, there'd be 3 on this judgment court. Greater than that, 150, larger cities, 7. Then the largest cities, they'd have 23 individuals who would sit and they would hear cases, and they would take in the evidence and talk about it and render verdict and pass judgment on the individual. So if a person was accused of murder, they'd be brought before the judgment court, and they would try them, and then they would give them the punishment that they deserve. And Jesus says, in the same way, now figuratively speaking, but in the exact same way, a person who has this seething anger towards his or her brother or sister will be subject to the exact same judgment court as a person who committed murder, because it's as if they are killing their brother and their sister in their hearts. So Jesus forever forbids anger which broods over, anger which never forgets, anger which will not let go, anger which seeks to hurt, anger which will not be satisfied. Anger which wants to take revenge. As followers of Jesus, he calls us to rid our hearts of anger that lingers too long. And that's the first level of anger. But then Jesus delves into the next level of anger, the unresolved kind of anger that leads to contempt. And he says, and again, anyone who says to his brother, Raka, is answerable to the Sanhedrin. Now, this word Raka is almost you can't translate it. It's very difficult to translate because it's about the tone of the voice rather than about the meaning of the word. Some think that it comes from the sound a person makes when they get their spittle rather together in the back of their throat, and if they want to spit on somebody. You know what I'm talking about? Oh, Raka. You get, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to spit on the TV. Okay, I'm not going to do it. But, you're trying to get the spit out so you can spit on the person that you have contempt for. Just the sound of Raka is the sound of contempt. And to have contempt toward another person is to ruthlessly put them down and to repeatedly degrade them. So in anger, I may want to hurt you, but in contempt, I don't care about you. And I don't care whether you're hurt or not. It's the sort of thing in our minds that you are so pathetic that you are not even worthy of my consideration one way or the other. And when we believe a person to be worthless, we begin to treat them as worthless. And we use different words. Instead of saying today, Raka, we would describe words using sexual or racial or cultural slurs. And by doing so, we dehumanize them. And when you dehumanize another person by calling them names, by showing them contempt, you degrade them. And it makes it easier to hurt them, to ignore them, to not care about them. And Jesus says, this contempt, since it's greater than anger, it is deserving of greater condemnation of the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court of the Jews. Anger that leads to condemnation. But then we have the worst of all, that anger where we call someone fool. But anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Wow. Boy, Jesus is really putting it out there, in fire of hell. And we think, hey, calling somebody a fool, that's nothing. We can think of a lot of words than you fool today to use, but it comes from the Greek word moros. When translated in our language, moron. Moron. And it's supposed to bring greater harm than either contempt or anger. It is a combination of the both, of seething anger and relentless contempt, withering contempt. And it has nothing to do with the person's mental ability or their acuity or anything like that. In calling a person your fool, Jesus says it's that person who runs another's reputation through the mud, their name, their reputation through the mud, and brands them as a degenerate, total waste of life person. You ever hear that phraseology? They're just a waste of life. They're just a waste of life. You ever said that about someone else? You ever had that said about you? And Jesus says that person who destroys another's name, another's reputation, will face the severest judgment of all, the fire of hell. And this word is translated Gehenna. It means literally the burning trash dump outside of Jerusalem. So that person No punishment is too severe. No trash dump is too hot for that person who trashes another's name and reputation. And Jesus says, and you've heard it said in days of old, do not murder. And murder is wrong. It's always wrong. Jesus is not denying that. Murder is wrong. But Jesus also says, along with a person's external actions, the physical actions they do on the outside, is the heart that they have on the inside. You see, long-lasting anger is bad, condemnation is worse, and a malicious tongue is worst of all. And a person who's a slave to anger, who speaks contempt, who has a malicious tongue, they have, in some ways, in their heart, committed an act of murder because they have a murderous heart. So Jesus is challenging us and the people who are listening. You know, the heart of the problem is the problem of the heart. And therefore, we conceal our hearts, but Jesus exposes them. And if this is indeed the case, if we are indeed wrong to hold anger, wrong to be condemning, wrong to be malicious, and it's coming out of our heart, then how do we fix our heart? Well, Jesus comes and says to us, therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave at that moment, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. Okay, here's the scene. This is what this looks like. A person is in the temple. They've come to offer their sacrifice, a lamb. And they're standing there at the altar, and the priest is beside them, and they're prepared to offer their sacrifice to God. But as they're standing there, God presses upon their heart this anger that they have inside of them, brings to mind that this individual that they are not right with, this condemning nature, this maliciousness. And they have a decision at that moment to make. Do they go through the sacrifice of their before God, or what do they do with it? And you see, offering one's sacrifice was so holy, and this is probably the holiest moment in this person's life, but it was so important that nothing could interrupt it. But Jesus says, if you're there, and in that moment, God lays on your heart the fact that your heart is not right, then you are to give your sacrifice to the priest. You are to immediately turn your back and walk out of the back of the temple to go find that person that you are not right with, that you're angry at, that you're malicious toward, that you're condemning of, and to confess your sins and ask for their forgiveness for you being angry at them. Man, pretty radical, huh? And you know what that would look like for us? I tried to imagine, what would that look like for us here in this at Temple Baptist? To me, it would be like when we come to communion. And you have taken the communion cup. And you've peeled back the bottom portion of it. And you take out the wafer that is inside. And you're holding it there between your thumb and your finger. Then you hear me repeat Jesus' words. This is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And in that moment, as you remember Jesus' body that was broken, Jesus breaks your heart. And he reminds you of your broken relationship. And you feel a great need to do something about it. So you take your wafer and you take your cup and you place them down and you walk out of the aisle and you walk out of the back of the church to go to them, to deal with whatever is broken in your relationship, to make things right. And why would you do this? Well, you do it because in that moment, Jesus makes known to you what every Jesus follower absolutely knows to be true. That you cannot be right with God until you are first right with others. I say that with me. You cannot be right with God until you're first right with others. You know, we have this vertical relationship with God. But this relationship cannot be and will not be what it needs to be, what God wants it to be, so that He can change us and make us into the people that He's called us to be, if we do not take seriously His call to be right with our brothers and sisters, with our family members, with their friends. You know, we can pretend that's not the case, but Jesus says it is exactly the case. And if this is true, then Jesus says, first go and be reconciled with your brother, with your sister, with your parent, with your sibling, with your neighbor, with your spouse, with your child. And then we're left with a dilemma. Do we first believe Jesus, that what He's saying is absolutely true? And the second harder question to answer, are we willing to obey Him? Are we willing to obey Him and take this radical action and make the relationship right? And in the process become Jesus to them. This is Decision Sunday. And there's two things I want us to consider to make a decision about this morning. And as you're just sitting there, just if you bow your heads, just close your eyes and just to separate yourself, make space for you to think on these things. Now, some of you here this morning, maybe what I've talked about today has no relevance. That all your relationships are good. You're not carrying any anger. But maybe today you have been thinking about that person that you're angry at. And I want you to right now, and it may be more than one. But as you're sitting here to think of, just see their face in your mind. Hear their voice. The words that hurt. Hear your voice. Feel that anger. And then pray. Jesus, help me with my anger. Help my condemning heart. Help my malicious tongue. Jesus, forgive me for being angry. Forgive me for the things I've said. Forgive me what the part I played in this relationship. And maybe it's because of something you've done to them, but maybe it's because of something they've done to you. But then pray, Jesus, this week, maybe even today, Jesus, today, help me call them up. Help me go to them. Help me extend the right hand first. Help me be willing to hug them. Help me be you to them. Make things right with them because, Jesus, I so desperately want things to be right with you. And Jesus, help me to absolutely do this. But maybe for you today, the decision is to begin to follow Jesus, to step across the line of faith. To say, Jesus, here I am, broken, uncertain, seeking, longing. Man, I want to know what it is to experience the life that you're talking about, that you want me to live. Jesus, I need you. Then ask Jesus to help you confess the sins of your past. Receive forgiveness in your present. And give your life to live for him in your future.